We have more for your ears only. I'm David Alpern.
I'm Catherine Herzog with this news quote. A huge proof of concept that you can cure someone if you can treat them early enough. That was Dr. Anthony Fauci, executive director of the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Diseases, on reports that a second baby born with HIV had apparently been cured by immediate administration of HIV suppression drugs. Also last week, 2 studies found 100% protection against AIDS in monkeys that got monthly injections of a retroviral drug, which could lead to a breakthrough in human AIDS prevention. Now this.
A team of negotiators from the International Monetary Fund is heading to Kiev to meet Ukraine's self-proclaimed authorities. They'll be discussing the terms of a crucial loan to save the country from default. Kiev is seeking $15 billion in aid, which falls well short of the estimated $35 billion that it will need by the end of 2015 to keep the economy afloat.
At the weekend, newly named Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk said Ukraine had secured that $15 billion in aid and that Kiev should receive the first $2 billion shortly. IMF European Department Director Reza Moghadam, after his trip to Kiev, was impressed by Ukraine's commitment to economic changes and said that the fund was ready to further help stabilize the country's failing economy.
But how effective will it prove, and with what social and political costs? Those questions focus special interest on a new investigation of how the IMF process and requirements recently impacted Mideast nations, where people power in squares and streets also changed regimes in the so-called Arab Spring. The study was conducted by the New America Foundation's Middle East Task Force in collaboration with the Arab NGO Network for Development and the Egyptian Center for Economic and Social Rights. To talk about its findings and recommendations for your ears only, we're joined by New America's Task Force Director, Leila Hilal. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
First, tell us in which countries and from what sources the findings for this report were drawn.
So we researched IMF staff reports for 5 countries of the Middle East and North Africa that are currently or were undergoing political transitions and or major reforms following the uprisings of 2011 and had historically had significant engagement with the IMF, those countries being Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, Tunisia, and Yemen. We also conducted extensive consultations with civil society leaders.
The major focus of your report seems to be the IMF's consistent advice to longstanding and reshaped Arab governments to dramatically reform or repeal subsidies for food and energy. How do those subsidies work?
The economies of the Middle East and North African region are the most heavily subsidized in the world, with energy subsidies or fuel subsidies being particularly staggering, amounting to nearly 8.5% of the region's GDP in 2011, or $240 billion. What happens is the government will cover the cost of the market fluctuations to ensure that the consumer will pay the same amount for petrol and fuel purchases, even though the prices may be higher at the global level.
Talk about how major changes in subsidies, especially for food, has impacted the health and welfare of populations involved, particularly the poor.
Well, we didn't do in-depth quantitative research on impact on the rich and on the poor, but what we believe is that the IMF undervalues that kind of impact, and we know that the poor certainly rely on these subsidies, let's say for food, for bread, for cheaper staples. And if the removal of those subsidies goes forward, then lower income persons are going to be paying more for basic needs.
And there have been fatal protests and other political pushback in Jordan, Egypt, Sudan. Remind us.
Well, we have seen a direct correlation between public unrest and major subsidy reforms. Overwhelmingly, implementation of such advice to cut subsidies has resulted in popular backlash and economic upheaval. For example, in Egypt in 1977, there was a repeal of food subsidies, and that provoked widespread widespread rioting. Jordan also has attempted to cut subsidies in 1989 and 1996, similarly triggering rioting and unrest. And then just recently we saw in Sudan, in September of last year, very violent, protesting and then very violent crackdown on those protesters that left 50 people dead. Our report accepts the notion that these subsidy expenditures should be ended, but how they're done and under what conditions are important, so that the lower income people, the fundamental population that doesn't feel the impact.
The report makes several recommendations to the IMF, including other short-term alternatives to subsidy reform. Can you give us some examples?
Sure. Well, we produced this report, as you mentioned, in partnership with organizations in the region, and there are large movements afoot among civil society in these countries to promote debt relief over further loan obligations being assumed. There is also some recommendations on progressive taxation and ensuring a better targeting of subsidy reform and improving social safety nets. Finally, the other important recommendation that we touch on is that we propose that some of the recommendations that need to be made from multilateral institutions and Western powers is for governments to cut back on military spending, which could help them consolidate fiscally.
Leila Hilal is director of New America Foundation's Middle East Task Force.
Money, 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 mark a buck for a pound. That clinking, clanking, clunking sound is all that makes the world go round. It makes the world go round.
Quote from the news, "People will always want an edge, and test changes always spur demand." That was Seppi Basili, Vice President of Kaplan Test Prep, after the announcement of changes in the Scholastic Aptitude Test to conform more to actual high school learning, with a less rarefied vocabulary test and an essay that's only optional.
Next, chilling childhood memories of China in World War II, for your ears only.